Hello, everybody. This is Rick Manning, President of Americans for Limited Government. We're live in living color from Fairfax, Virginia, and I want to touch base and talk about a couple of different things that are kind of live and happening right now. One of the craziest things that's going on is the House Democrats, the Progressive Caucus of the House Democrats, 99 members, put out this talking points screed, which had all sorts of crazy stuff in it. But I'm going to focus on what they want to do in terms of energy production. Only the left would look at what's happened in the vice that Germany is in due to their reliance on so-called renewable energy, and say, hey, that's what we need to invest in. That's what we need to do. After all, we've got all this oil and natural gas, and we can't possibly destroy America's free enterprise system with all this available energy that we can produce here. So we need to get rid of it. We need to be reliant upon energy that is neither reliable nor storable, and that would be wind and solar. Let's just talk for a second about what that means. Wind and solar have a fundamental problem, and when this problem gets solved, it may be a viable piece of the overall energy infrastructure. But the reason it isn't reliable is because we don't have the capacity to store it very well. Because wind and solar, because without the capacity to create batteries that have the capacity to store a lot of electricity in them, you effectively, once the wind stops blowing and once the sun stops shining, no more electricity is being generated. And because you can't store the wind and solar, battery life is not enough, and the storage capacity isn't big enough. Because you can't store it, those power generation sources are gone for the day. And so while they may offset some use of other energy sources during the day, they are useless at night. At least solar is useless at night. Wind's useless when the wind isn't blowing. And so, or when the wind mills freeze up, or when they stop working, which they do pretty rapidly, when they rust out, all those different things. And so, while the environmentalists want to talk about wind and solar being an actual alternative, until we solve the battery problem, they aren't. They just aren't. They are a small offset that make it so you don't have to use as much natural gas, as much coal, as much nuclear to be able to meet your needs over the course of a 24-hour day. But they aren't a solution on a day-to-day basis. They're merely kind of an auxiliary power source, which lowers your need to use those other sources. Here's a simple way of understanding it. With coal, utilities that burn coal have piles of coal sitting outside their facility in storage. And they know that they have 30 days, 45 days, 60 days of coal, of fuel, to continue fueling that utility, regardless of what happens in supply chain on railroads and coal mines and the like. So they know that they have a stockpile of being able to provide energy for 30 to 60 days. What that means is that coal is resilient. You can depend on it. It has the capacity to be there for a long period of time without a single coal train running. And so that makes it reliable. Well, with natural gas, similarly, they have the capacity to store natural gas outside the facilities. Natural gas burns a little less efficiently than coal, and so you get less energy from natural gas than you do from coal, but you do get a lot of energy from natural gas. And you can store it. You have storage tanks outside the facility, and so if a pipeline ends up not functioning or something disrupts the flow, you have a stockpile of natural gas, which can then be utilized and tapped into to actually make it so your power plants work. Nuclear, that's obvious because there's no input in terms of or very little input in terms of outside sources to generate the electricity. obviously, rivers and hydro, the rivers could keep running. So as long as the rivers keep running, you're going to have hydro. And so that's part of it. All those things continue to work and you depend on them. And that's where we have to put our majority of in fact, not just a majority, we have to produce every bit of electricity that we need, have the capacity to do so from power plants that are reliant upon those sources. And any kind of offset from wind and solar without battery is a nice little way of putting some energy, electricity in the system that otherwise wouldn't exist. But the reality is it can't be used, can't be depended upon, and electricity, which is not reliable, effectively if we're dependent upon it, turns us into a third world nation where the lights go off in the middle of the day, in the middle of the night, because we just ran out of energy. A third world nation, somewhat like California, where they have recently told drivers, just this last week, told drivers of electric vehicles and urged them not to charge up the cars because they have a shortage of electricity for reasons that I'm not sure why they do, but they have cut their various supplies of electricity. They've cut nuclear, they've cut coal. They're trying to become completely dependent upon renewables, so-called renewables. And in doing so, they are now having to tell those drivers of electric cars, turn your cars into bricks because we won't be refueling you at the fueling stations that we're providing because we don't have the electricity to do so. So, that's California being the progressive state it is the exact example of why we shouldn't do what those folks are saying, what the Progressive Caucus is saying. But believe it or not, 99% of them, or 99 Congressional Progressive Caucus members, signed a document which urged us, the federal government, Joe Biden, to immediately cancel all oil and natural gas production on federal lands. To say, okay, we don't care if we lease the land to you. We don't care if you bought the rights to the land for a period of time. We don't care that. We're just going to cancel the lease immediately and say you can't continue to utilize it because they want a climate emergency to be declared, a climate emergency. So suddenly John Kerry becomes Anthony Fauci. And John Kerry, the man who, when Russia invaded Ukraine, his first reaction was, oh, I hope this doesn't deter Vladimir Putin's commitment to climate change and commitment to stopping producing carbon. You just go, and CO2. I mean, who is this guy? He's a complete nut. And he could have been president, but fortunately we dodged that bullet. But he's a complete nut. But that's who would be the Fauci for the climate emergency. And you can just see John Kerry running around when he gets off of his yacht and he stops playing squash. You can see him running around and dictating that people have to can't drive any car that gets that doesn't get at least 50 miles per gallon, and saying and disrupting oil supplies to force people into into not being able to do anything, taking industries and saying, no, you have creating edicts where they have to convert over to the proscribed forms of energy that can exist. To say, when you see all the craziness with Anthony Fauci of sitting there and changing the rules on a seemingly daily basis, going off and where the federal government goes on the attack against any treatment that actually works and doesn't allow those treatments to be given, moves against hospitals and others who would sit there and dare to try to have treatments available for their patients when it came to COVID. When you saw all that, having experienced all that, imagine the mischief that could be done from the federal level if they were given carte blanche, the crazies were given carte blanche to do whatever they could to try to kill the oil and natural gas industries in this country. Oh, one of the great ideas they have is, now recognize, Congress passed legislation that allowed for, and Obama signed it, by the way, that allowed for the export of U.S. oil, okay, and natural gas. Congress passed that legislation. So it is a law passed by Congress, signed by the president. They want Joe Biden flip of a pen to say, nope, we're ending that. We're not going to allow any export of oil and natural gas. Let me tell you what that means. It's pretty. I'm not going to even focus on natural gas too much. I'll tell you in oil what it means. The oil that we produce out of the Bakken oil fields and out of I think out of the Eagle Ford as well in Texas, but Bakken's in North Dakota, is a different type of oil than we have the capacity to refine in America. So we actually export that oil. We import heavy sour. We import oil that we do refine and that our refiners are set to deal with. So, and because of that, we essentially pay for the oil we import with the oil we export. That's the payment system. If you effectively say we can't export oil, you might as well cap the Bakken oil field because we don't have the capacity to refine it. And I'll guarantee you the Biden administration is going to allow for refineries to be built and retooled to refine it because that's against their climate agenda. So you effectively shut off the value of the fracking. If you're not allowed to export natural gas, Germany, which is sitting there with dependent upon Russia, every single country that's dependent upon Russia for natural gas is suddenly that much more dependent upon Russia for natural gas because we can't help provide it. That's how myopic these people are. But let's get to one of the key elements of the renewables and why I think this is even more pernicious than just being stupid. China controls, believe it or not, they control 55% of the world's mining capacity. 55% of the entire world's mining capacity is controlled by China. They have set up mining companies all over the world. And, for instance, in Greenland, they set up a mining company. It's called, I think it's called the Australian Mining Company, actually, but it's Chinese controlled. And they have a rare earth mineral mine in Greenland that is taking the rare earth minerals out of the ground, putting them on ships and shipping them around the world to China where they're refined. So because China also controls 85% of global mining refining. It's crazy enough that we have a rare earth mineral mine in the Las Vegas area. It's really our only new mine we've done in a long time, but it's a rare earth mineral mine. It was developed. Donald Trump pushed to have it developed. I think it's in production now. But here's what the key is. When they first were doing this, when the mine was first opened and before it was shut down under Obama and then reopened under Trump, the mine was shipping, the plan was to ship the ore to China to be refined. So if China doesn't, it doesn't really matter if China doesn't control the mine, if they control the refining, and once you send the minerals to China, they're the ones who control where they get sent to and how they get used. So China controls 85% of the global mining refining capacity. And until America starts refining our own ore and going back to smelting our own ore, and this may be old news, old data, but 6-7 years ago, this was true. America had not opened a new mineral smelting factory, smelting capacity in 50 years. We closed them down because it's been deemed to be environmentally not in conformance with the Environmental Clean Air Law. And so we've been eliminating our own capacity to refine metal, turn rock into usable material. And guess who doesn't care about the air? China. So they said, send it to us. The plan for instance, the mine up that ended up doesn't appear it's going to happen up in Alaska, Pebble Mine. Pebble Mine had $1 trillion of metal in the ground, and we can't get the permits to actually get them out of the ground. But one of the problems with that is even with mining that ore, we were going to have to put it on ships and ship it to South Korea to be smelted there because we didn't have the capacity to do it here. So we've effectively put ourselves at the mercy of countries around the world because we've chosen to effectively become a mineral donor country rather than a country that can be self-sufficient. It's stupid, it's short-sighted, and so I want to tie it together. Think about the results. Who controls lithium production? Well, Chinese, by and large. Lithium is needed for batteries. So the battery capacity to do the electricity, make it work. China controls the minerals that would do that. Who controls it? And even if you had lithium capacity and you were able to develop it, well, guess what? You'd have to send a rock to China to get it processed because we don't have the processing capacity here. So who's the big winner in if the 99 progressive clowns got their way? Big winner is China, because they would force America to be completely dependent upon China to be able to actually outfit and build the facilities they want to build. Solar panels, they're built in China. We tried to build solar panels, and Obama tried to build solar panels. Remember Solyndra, where invested about $200 million in the company. I guess it's $400 million in the company. And it went belly up because they couldn't compete with cheaper Chinese goods. It's that simple. Then China bought the factory. We did A123 batteries, another Obama creation. And we invested 150 million in A123 batteries. Developed some really good technology there, but they couldn't compete because it was very expensive to build batteries and they couldn't get the materials. So consequently, what happened? Well, China bought the company for pennies on the dollar and got the technology that our hard-earned tax dollars created. So who are the big beneficiaries? Who are the 99 so-called progressives? Who are they fronting for? Well, whether they know it or not, they're fronting for the Chinese. The Chinese are the big beneficiaries of this whole green agenda. And the Chinese have negotiated themselves out of the Paris Climate Accord, so they don't have to follow it until 2030, by which time they will have completely neutered the West and hamstrung our economies because we will be dependent upon China to be able to get the materials to meet the energy goals, our energy needs. And China can choke those off at any time because that's who they are. Just like Russia's choking off natural gas to Germany, China will choke off the ability to get the raw materials necessary to build the things that you need to reach this so-called green economy, relying on wind and solar. So even if you had the battery capacity, even if you had a genius ability to suddenly store massive amounts of electricity in a battery that wasn't the size of the state of Utah, even if you had that capacity, you know what you wouldn't have? If the battery worked, you wouldn't have the capacity to build the battery because you'd be dependent upon China to do it. So folks, the Chinese are the big beneficiaries. These congressional progressive caucus folks, the 99 House Democrats that signed their climate demands to Biden, are nothing more than dupes, willing or unwilling dupes of the Chinese government. And as a result, they need to be scorned. They need to be laughed at. They need to be called what they are, which is fools at best. And I'm not going to use this term because Biden uses it too loosely, but let's say people who don't have America's best interests at heart at worst. So that's the climate attack, this absurd climate attack at a time when the rest of the world looks at what's happening in China, Russia having the capacity to strangle Europe through energy because Europe's energy dependent, to say, gee, I think that's a great idea. That's what we ought to do to America. We ought to make America energy dependent upon countries that don't like us very much. And those people who believe that are either so misguided in their overall goals that they don't understand the results of what they do, or they're misguided in terms of where their loyalties lie. And they have to be rejected. We have to beat them soundly. And the only way to beat them soundly is make sure they never gain control. Joe Biden, this whole COVID emergency, you could almost say that it was a run-up, a test to be able to do a climate emergency. Because after all, if you believe the great scholar Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, or the high school student from Sweden, she's from Sweden, Norway, somewhere there. If you listen to them, 10 years, the entire world goes upside down and we all die, because you'll never be able to fix the climate emergency. And that 10 years was 2 years ago. So we're down to 8 years. And that's that's the way they look at the world. They view that the end of the world is coming within the next 8 to 10 years. And so there's nothing that can be done that's too extreme to save the world in their estimation. And so that's the end of the free enterprise economy. That's the end of freedom in America and around the world. And we become energy dependent on the Chinese. When we have the energy resources and they don't have energy resources, when they don't follow any of these rules, and yet we become energy dependent on them because they have systematically gone around the world and have controlled the mining all around the world. And by gaining control of the mining resources around the world, by shipping, having control of ports around the world due to their Silk Road, their Silk, what is it? It's the Silk Belt, the Belt, I don't remember. It's their Belt and Road Initiative, that's what's called. Their Belt and Road Initiative. Because of that, they control a lot of the ports in Africa. They control a lot of the ports around the world because they lent the countries the money to build them. And then the countries couldn't pay them back. So they took control of their ports. They took control of their railway systems. And so so they have built the infrastructure around the world to be able to grab those minerals and ship them anywhere they want to, and ship them back to Chinese ports to be processed in China. So China controls, whether you mine it here or not, they control the actual distribution of mineral, because a rock does you no good unless you get the minerals out of it. That's where we are. It's that simple. And we have about a little less than 1/4 of the House of Representatives who have proven that they're on the crazy train and want a dependent America to a dominant China. It's insane. I have to believe they don't know what they're saying. They don't realize what that means, because to believe anything else is to really hold them in such low esteem as to be unimaginable. So that's what the situation there. I found it was interesting that they came up with this, and strange in this timetable that they would. Let's talk about something else, because I think and I know I'm going to talk about inflation. So be careful. I'm not going to talk long about it. This is just a little bit on the economic side, but there's a couple of things that are interesting that are happening. First of all, oil and gas prices, they bounced a little bit yesterday up, but they have been dropping pretty precipitously for 3, 4, 5 days. And they were down about $20 per barrel, over $25 per barrel, over their highs a couple of days ago. It's bounced up a little bit since then, and we were looking desperately to try to figure out why what was going on, how come this happened. And the answer was simple. It turned out that when we found the answer, it wasn't because the Saudis were pumping more oil, although that was the natural assumption. They weren't. It wasn't because there was any oil being pumped anywhere else more. It wasn't because Biden suddenly softened his stand and was going to let more energy production here domestically or anywhere else. It was a simple economic thing. The estimates now are that the Chinese economy, because of COVID and because of some other problems they're having, the Chinese economy is dramatically underperforming. And because they're dramatically underperforming, they're not expected to burn as much oil. And because they're not going to burn as much oil, and they're a huge consumer of oil, and they have no domestic oil, they buy it all off the world market, because they're not going to be consuming as much oil, the world oil price, the futures price, the expectation of how much what the demand will be for oil versus supply, is that the demand is going to go down. And so it had absolutely nothing to do with increasing supply. It had everything to do with an anticipation that China was going to need less oil, was going to be a lesser customer for oil, wasn't going to consume as much oil because their economy is stumbling, partially because of COVID and partially because of other factors. So that's so we saw that, which is good news on the inflation front, especially on the energy inflation front. On the other hand, we saw the Federal Reserve yesterday increase the interest rate by 1/4 point. And that's the rate that the Federal Reserve charges banks to borrow money out of the government from the Federal Reserve, which then they flow through the economy eventually to loan to other people or buy government bonds or whatever. So the cost of money went up by 1/4 point. A lot of people thought that it was going to go up by 1/2 point, but it went up because of the 8% inflation. The inflation 7.9%. The producer price index going up 10% a month for 2 months in a row, and just you see inflation washing through the system in all levels. And the expectation was when you had the highest inflation rate in 40 years, you had the highest producer price index rate since that index was created. That the Fed would stomp on it hard. Well, they didn't. They gave a pretty tepid response, a 1/4 point increase, with the thought being they're going to do a 1/4 point increase every month for the next 7 months as their means of kind of dealing with inflation. Here's the thinking here's what that means in my estimation. There's a lot of data that indicates that our economy is heading towards recession. And all the happy talk aside, we have a number of indicators that that's the case. Historically speaking, when inflation gets really high, it slows the economy down because it takes a lot of money out of the economy, sucks up money out of the economy. That's what inflation is. It devalues the dollar. And so because there's less buying power, because your money's worth less, it effectively is a massive tax on everything you buy. And that causes the economy to slow because your purchasing power is down, so you can't buy as much. So not as much needs to be produced, not as much needs to be shipped. And your overall gross domestic product goes down, and it goes down 2 quarters in a row, and that's called a recession. And so that's kind of the historical pattern. The fact that the Federal Reserve did not go a 1/2 point tells you that the Federal Reserve is extremely concerned that they don't want to push the brakes on the economy through raising the interest rates to the extent that they would precipitate a recession. And so this kind of, we're going to do an interest rate increase every month for the next 7 months, is a way for them to back out of it any given time as the economy begins to slip. A couple of things for people who are trying to figure this out, maybe investors and others. What you need to be looking at is the 10-year bond rate for Treasury bills and the 2-year bond rate for Treasury bills. 2 years means that's how long, you buy it for 2 years. If you hold on to it, it expires in 2 years. Okay, that's the length of the bond. 10 years, it's 10-year length. When the interest rate, typically the 10-year rate, it pays a higher rate than the 2-year rate. Okay, so the 2-year rate pays a lower interest rate than the 10-year rate, typically. But when you're heading towards recession, and particularly there's a signal, and it's worked most times. Didn't work recently, but we had COVID get in the way. But it's worked most times, and that is if the 10-year rate becomes less than the 2-year rate, what that says is investors want a higher rate of return for a short-term investment than they do for a long-term investment. And they want that because they don't anticipate that other investments are going to be very good. So they're pushing that higher rate of return for the short-term rates. And so those two, when they cross over, 10-year goes this way, 2-year goes that way. When they cross over, historically, within 18 months, you have a recession. My bet is you're going to be that's a lot closer. And it's largely because we're running out of labor force. And we have about 11 million jobs that are unfilled. And we have a pretty big problem in that there's more people who are going from 64 to 65, where they're at the age where they're exiting the labor force, than are going from 15 to 16. And so we have this drain of labor because of the aging population. And in other countries where that's occurred, like Japan, it has signaled that you're going to have pretty tough economic times. And a lot of factors have to go into play to try to offset that. I believe what will happen is you'll end up with high inflation, relatively high inflation. It'll moderate some. You're going to have relatively high inflation, and you have a labor shortage. So what do businesses do? What Intel's most likely going to do with their plant they're going to build, I think it's in Ohio. They're going to mechanize. They're going to use robotics and AI to take care of all the line jobs, and they will be paying people at the top end, top management level, and IT levels. But most of the jobs that would be by factory workers are going to be robotics, and even more so than you see in car plants now. And so you're just going to find yourselves and that's where the mechanization, when businesses can't find employees, it forces them to mechanize. And so you're going to see over the next 5 years a dramatic increase in the use of robotics and AI with the 5G technology and coming 6G technology, where there's very little latency between where a command you don't get buffering, okay, to put it the best way. You don't get buffering. So if a command goes from the brain to the robot, it hits immediately. The robot can then report back to the brain, okay, well, I'm low on oil, let's say. Well, then the brain sends another robot out that either fills it up with oil, or greases its elbows, or whatever it needs to do, or that robot leaves the lines, replaced by another robot. That robot gets repair made by a robot that's trained to do that, and then is in waiting for the next robot that needs to be replaced. That's the kind of mechanized system that's the factory of the future, as much as I hate to say it. And the labor shortage, the current labor shortage, combined with the lowering number of people who are in the prime 16 to 64 working demographic, combined with the high cost of labor, is going to precipitate that change much more rapidly than I think most people, most economists thought it was, and I think most futurists thought it was going to happen. And so the world's going to change a little bit because of this. And that's one of the things that we take a look at, because as that world changes, we have to make certain that civil liberties remain. We have to make certain that the ability of America to produce jobs for citizens remain, and that concepts like universal basic income, which would make the population completely, middle-class population, completely dependent upon the federal government for their livelihoods, not get put into place. Those are the kind of things that we have to fight against in order to keep economic freedom and personal freedom intact in this country. And so we look at those kind of futuristic things and say, what does that mean? What are the challenges? How do we make certain that in a future world that is going to happen, we can't do much about it? How do we deal with that? And so that's why we start talking about things sometimes that seem kind of esoteric, but those are the kind of decisions that if you had a forward-looking Congress, if you had a real thinking Congress that wasn't just acting from day to day and kind of bouncing between shiny objects, they'd be really focused on, because those are the policy decisions, the laws that need to be made to try to make certain that we have a system that expands freedom while providing the ability and making certain that we can become the factory of the future, the actual industrial base of the world. But we have to do things to do that. We have to have smart policies to do that. We have to open up mining in America to do that. We have to build smelters in America to do that. We have to begin to actually take a look at what's in our interests and start doing those things. We have such an abundance of wealth, natural wealth in this country. The Pebble Mine, for instance, has rhodinium in it, which is a rare earth metal that's needed to build aircraft engines. Well, the decision, up until now has been they don't want to get that gold, silver, copper, and rhodinium out of the ground because of concerns that 200 miles away there might be dirt that ends up into the Bristol Bay. Give me a break. It's at some point we have to be able to mine our own resources. And this war on mining is a war on our ability to exist. And so, folks, that's why I brought up the climate. That's why I brought up the economy, and they all tie together. And with that, I'm going to start taking some look at some of the comments here. I've babbled enough. Let's see what people are saying. Let's see. I won't be watching this next generation. Thank you. Let's see. I love to see what Biden would say to try to justify a climate emergency, especially given that the atmospheric temperature has only raised 1 degree in the past 100 years. Well, I mean, it's easy to do what Biden would say. They have their made up oceans are going to rise and we're going to end up with coastal cities flooding and it's going to be a disaster. And that's what they've been promising. That's what they say will happen. And they're saying, essentially Antarctica is going to all melt and we're going to be underwater. That's what the left has been saying for a long time. And what belies that is when Barack Obama buys a place on the water at Martha's Vineyard, when the left tends to love to live on the shore. If you really believe this, you'd be building on high ground. But no, the left is more than happy to buy on the shore, which tells you they don't believe their own garbage, because otherwise they'd be acting like it was a true climate emergency. And so they're not. They don't act that way with their own dollars. They don't act that way with their own lives. They don't cease to fly in private jets to every one of these climate meetings. And until they start acting like it's a real emergency, I'm not going to actually believe them when they say it is. Let's see, what else do we have? They're using climate change against us. Yes, they are. Let's see. There's some fun comments on here. I'm going to try to go through here. I'm going to just show Roland Snyder's. Why did they do this without anything in place or a plan? If you fail to plan, you plan to fail. Well, they have a plan, and their plan is to fail. Okay, let's just be clear. I really can't say this strongly enough. The objective of this entire climate emergency, of the Paris Climate Accord, the overall objective was the UN head of the climate part of the UN said a couple of years ago that this is an opportunity for the entire economic structure of the world the economy of the world to be restructured. They view this as being the moment in time when they can reject capitalism and create a more oligarchical system that's controlled by a few elites, because they think they're going to be the elites. And so this is really, and always has been, an attack on capitalism. That's just the truth. And in order to accomplish their goal, they have to take down the United States, because we're the one sovereign power that can put a kink in their whole system. And the way to take down the United States is make us dependent upon people around the world, so we're no longer an independent sovereign nation. And that's the reality. So they do have a plan. Their plan is to fail. It's not a plan to succeed. It's a plan for America to fail. And that's why they were so upset by Donald Trump saying, "Make America great again," and saying America first, because that's not what they agree with. So they may not be honest with you, but that's just the truth based on their policies. Let's see here. What else do we have? Okay, we're talking inflation. Inflation, $50 more for a vet med. I paid $664 3 months ago. Yeah. Um, you know, I don't know if I don't know what world some of these guys are living in, but um, to the real problem with inflation, we haven't even begun to see it because farmers right now have had to make decisions about what fields to plant. They've had to decide if they can afford to run a tractor because all tractors run on diesel. If they can afford to run a tractor, they have to make a decision how much it's going to cost to get their product to market because they don't know right now. Truckers are deciding whether or not they can run their trucks based on how much they can charge for the load. And so truckers are trying to make a decision. Can you afford to do a short load, a short haul load? And those are decisions that affect your farmers. So you have this circumstance where farmers are deciding, well, I'm not going to plant my least productive fields because I need maximum productivity to get the most, let's say potatoes, the most potatoes out of the ground as possible for as little money as possible. And running a tractor over a field that doesn't produce as many potatoes doesn't make sense. So you're going to have fewer potatoes coming out of the ground because of diesel fuel costs. And then you're going to have, because of trucking costs, some farmers are going to find that they can't get their product to market because there's a shortage of trucks willing to drive with the high diesel costs. And then it's going to get, so when it gets to market, whether it's turned into French fries, processed food, or just a potato that you can bake, whether it's the French fry from McDonald's or it's a baked potato with a restaurant, that's going to be a more expensive baked potato because there'll be less supply of potatoes and it costs them more to get it from point A to point B. Those two factors drive up the price. And so your food costs are going to be negatively impacted. You're going to have higher food costs regardless. That happens in basically that's from a beginning, from ground to table. That's what we're going to see. It's the reality of the impact of the anti-energy policy that Biden has. And so, yeah, inflation is going to get worse. I hate to say it. Let's see. More bleeding from the middle class so they can take more money for, yeah. This is the one calculation that I think politically that the Democrats are going to regret. It's been 40 years since we've had really high inflation. During the Reagan era, the inflation went down, taxes went down. We ended up with a robust economy. And the robust economy was almost as much because the inflation, the amount of the hidden tax of inflation went down along with the actual taxes you were paying. Those two things combined to create real fuel for the U.S. economy for 20 years. But if people are not used to the expectation that prices are going to go up, when I grew up, we knew prices were going to go up. Okay, prices are going up. That was the expectation. It was built into the cake. You knew, and oh, by the way, you also knew that your raise that you were getting, based on last year's inflation, were going to go away because of this year's inflation and you actually were going to make less money this year than you did last year, and you had to prepare accordingly because it was a net drain on the middle class. And this is really a tax on the middle class and the lower class. People in the bottom 3 quintiles of earnings in our society because they have the least capacity to control their own income. And as a result, it has devastating impacts. And when you tell somebody gee whiz, I don't care that gas is $4 a gallon. Pete Buttigieg, Secretary of Transportation, if you don't like the price of gas, go buy a Tesla. Telling somebody who's driving a 10-year-old car who they keep up with keeping it running and keeping it in gas and trying to just get along, telling them go buy a Tesla, they might as well tell them to take a trip to the moon I mean, that's how out of touch this administration is and how dedicated they are to destroying our energy system. Let's see here. What else do we have? Ba, 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 ba. Okay, sad to automobile industry. This is from Betty Belshi. Is it Belshi or Belch? Sad to automate industry, human employees first. Good grief. When are we going to stop this ignorance that is ruining America? U.S. versus, okay. Yeah, I mean, that's one of the real challenges in terms of where we're going as a country. What's going to happen and is that we have to be able to train the humans, real people, to be able to perform functions and be able to perform those functions that meet the needs of the 21st century world. That has to happen. That actually, but the way that we need to do it has to change. And I worked Department of Labor for 2.5 years back during the Bush administration and the second Bush administration. And one of the things that became clear to me when I was working there was that federal government training programs are failures. We spend a lot of money, federal government spent a lot of money, whether it didn't matter if it was under W, didn't matter if it was under Trump, didn't matter if it was under Obama, didn't matter if it's under Biden, spends a lot of money on training people. And the problem with it is it takes you put out what's called an RFP, request for proposal, from all these different people saying, hey, apply for government money to train people. So all these people apply for government money to train people based on what they think the needs are right now. And so it takes 6 months, you get the proposals and you do a grant. Okay, so you do a grant 6 to 9 months later. The economic situation on the ground has changed. If you needed workers for one purpose 9 months ago, the businesses who needed those workers have trained and hired those workers already. So then the federal government gives money to a local government or to a community college or somebody to do a training program, or a union for that matter, to do a training program to meet the needs of a year ago. And so they train a bunch of people, and it takes 6 months to train a bunch of people. So now it's a year and a half from when the actual need was seen. And those people go out and there aren't any jobs because the businesses have already trained them. If you actually want to do a training program, and this would be a massive change in the way government does things, but if you actually want to do a training program, what you ought to do is you ought to put a per employee credit for businesses that allows them, if they train an employee and they stay there for 3-6 months, put some time limit on it, that they get a significant tax rebate. Maybe the employee's salary paid for those 3 months. I don't know. You make it so it works for them. And that way, we are retraining, we are investing in retraining American workers in a way where businesses are actually retraining workers for jobs they need done right now. It would incentivize people to take who's sweeping the floor and train them to be somebody who's working a machine or working a lathe. It would put the incentive to bring people from the minimum wage job to a middle wage job. And it would make it so those businesses that were investing in their employees, that the taxpayers would share in that investment. If we're going to spend the money on training, let's at least spend the money on training that makes sense and that doesn't produce. I'll give you the example that's the one that always sticks in my head. We had a grant about in 2007 that we put out to train financial services workers. Okay, so we're busy training financial services workers in 2007. 2008, we had a grant to retrain financial services workers because the housing industry collapsed. The whole countrywide thing happened, and so we went from training people a year before to do a job to then retraining those people to do a different job. The federal government doesn't know what's going to happen, what jobs are needed in any one given place until afterward. They don't know in advance. They're not qualified to make that judgment. And to have people sit there and petition for money for the federal government to be able to train people for something that's they're in need for a year and a half later makes no sense. What we need is, if we're going to do training, if we're going to make it a government priority to try to retrain people so we can use the human capital the human capital that exists in this country, then darn it, let's let the businesses who need to retrain those people, who need to train the employees, let's let them train them. Let's incentivize them to train them, and let's get out of the way in terms of a bureaucracy trying to figure out what the right training thing is based on what state they're trying to influence the election in. I mean, it's just garbage. We have to change the system. We got to take the federal government out of that decision, put it and privatize it. Best way is through tax credits. So that's my labor rant for the day. Glad I could get that out of my system. See what else we have. Let's see. Biden can't possibly push an EO on something. Well, Linda, Biden can push an EO on something that's catastrophic for our economy. It doesn't mean that he'll stand up in court, but he certainly can. And the precedent with COVID is, they've pretty much gotten away with everything they wanted to do with COVID. And we couldn't even get the Senate to stand up and say, the Senate Republicans to stand up and say, we will not fund the enforcement of the COVID mandates that throw people out of work, that are hurting our military, that are hurting federal workers, are hurting defense contractors. We can't even get the Congress, the Republicans in the Senate to say, we will not fund that. We will not vote for a bill that funds that, because they did. Okay. And we fought that hard. We put 25 million emails into Congress in a 3-week period. In fact, over 25 million emails into Congress in a 3-week period. And you know what? We got votes out of it. We know that 50 Republicans politically will say, I don't want a vaccine mandate. And they voted that way. But what we didn't get was them actually taking the step necessary to stop it. We had great fighters on that. Representative Chip Roy from Texas, phenomenal guy. I've known him for a long time. He is a fighter. He doesn't care. He'll do what he thinks is necessary to protect this country. And he fought like crazy on this. Senator Mike Lee from Utah, up for re-election this year, and in a state that Mitt Romney doesn't like him very much. So I'd check him out, and if there's anything you can do to help him out, he's a great guy. He led the charge on this. He forced votes on the floor on this issue. Ted Cruz was right there alongside. We had Ron Johnson from Wisconsin, who was in the fight. So there's a lot of heroes in this. Unfortunately, when we had a chance to win, we had a continuing resolution. It funded the government for 3 weeks, but once you get something in that, it's very hard to get it out. We had a continuing resolution that funded the government for 3 weeks from back in December, I guess back in February 11th to whatever it is, February 15th to March 11th. And Mike Lee forced a vote. And the Democrats had 47 people there. And so there are 47 no votes. All we need was 48 yes votes to amend the continuing resolution to end the enforcement of vaccine mandates. Lindsey Graham was in Israel and missed the vote. Okay. We tried to get him to come back. It didn't happen. Mitt Romney went to the airport. James Inhofe from Oklahoma went to the airport. Richard Burr from North Carolina went to the airport. As soon as those three went to the airport, knowing that Lindsey Graham was out of town, that's when Chuck Schumer voted the bill. We lost 47-46. So, yeah, that's disappointing. Recognize all those people had voted before that they didn't like the vaccine mandate. But when it came down to really whether or not you were going to actually do something about it, we didn't have the votes. And that is why we have to push harder. We have to understand this isn't partisan, although it tends to line up that way. This is about getting partisans who actually are willing to fight for this country. And like I say, I've given you 4 heroes on that. There's a lot of other heroes, but just understand, Chip Roy took on a lot of the power structure in the House by pushing the way he did. He told tales that people don't tell in Washington, D.C. He fought with that, with all the knowledge he has, and he put it out there. And he's a guy who needs to be applauded. And so I'm just giving you some names of some people who need to be applauded. And so take that as you will. Let's see. solar activity and weakened magnetosphere more important in climate change than man-made activities? Um, yeah. Um, yeah, Anita, you're 100% correct. While there's a solar flare, there's supposedly a big solar flare right now. There was here's what's true. We are in the midst of what is actually a cooling cycle for the sun. The last time we were in this kind of cooling cycle was in the 1600s and early 1700s. It's a time in our world's history where the Thames River froze, where it was very cold, and because the sun was not burning as hot as it normally does, and so the Earth got colder. Imagine that. And the last time we had this, we were, it's a moderate minimum. Last time we had this, it was very cold. We are in that cycle. It's projected we'll be in that cycle until 2050. And so if anything, you can expect the Earth to significantly cool over the next 30 years. And as opposed to the predictions of those who believe that CO2 in the atmosphere and an increase of 1/10 of a degree worldwide is somehow going to be catastrophic to the future of the entire planet. So that's the reality. What actual astronomers are saying is going to happen. Once again, it's the Maunder minimum. Look it up if you want to. MAUNDER minimum. It's so go in there, look at it, you'll see what it is, and that's the cycle we're in. And it's really hard to know that and take anything they talk about in terms of increased temperatures seriously. Hope that answered your question, at least affirms your question, Anita. Let's see what else we got. Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt that there is. Once again, I'm going to just say that there is a move, and I hesitated to attribute specific having any real breadth in terms of people understanding this, but the net effect of a lot of the things that are going on, everything ranged from the trying to go to a straight digital currency to a lot of the social justice stuff, the ability to put people into determine whether somebody's been a good social citizen and close them off if they haven't been, determine whether they can spend their own money, all those kind of things. Things are happening in China now, social credit scores, and are being exported around the world. It's hard to say that any of those things are anything but an attempt to control the populace and destroy the populace. And oh, by the way, once the government can say, if you own an electric vehicle, and some people right now are pushing Elon Musk to turn the switch on Teslas in Ukraine or in Russia and effectively turn them off remotely and turn them into bricks. Well, isn't that wonderful? So Joe Biden wants us all to be in electric cars within, or at least 50% has to be in electric cars by 2030. Well, if the federal government could just basically switch a switch and say you can't drive your car, it's no longer your car. If they can switch a switch and say, no, you can't access your bank account, as the Canadian government did the Canadian truckers, suddenly it's no longer your money. And so a lot of these fights that we're having that seem esoteric, the fight over Federal Reserve governor, who was Sarah Raskin, who was defeated and dropped out. That fight was, she wanted to do essentially social credit scores and make that an emphasis of the Federal Reserve. And she was not confirmed because of that. Because one Democrat said, no, that was Joe Manchin. All the rest of the Democrats were okay with it, by the way. So that's so that's the reality. There's a lot of threats to freedom. And whether you ascribe it to one man or you just ascribe it to a group or you ascribe it to just plain and simple stupidity or a desire to have government control over every aspect of your life and And because some people think they know better what to do with your funds and with your life than you do. Whether you ascribe, no matter what you ascribe it to, bottom line is dangerous, and we fight against it every day. Let's see here. You guys are typing in faster than I can do it. Okay, so I'm going to go with this last one, and that's a training needs such as CRT and how to address someone according to their gender identity. Great question. Yeah, I will tell you what. One of the things I asked I asked people I knew on the Hill was this. There was one of the ways that the Democrats got, and Mitch McConnell for that matter, got the Republicans to vote for the omnibus funding bill was they kicked in about $40 billion extra into the defense budget. I think it's $41 billion extra into the defense budget. And so the defense hawks all said, yay, we're getting more spending for the Pentagon, and we're going to vote for it no matter what else it contains. And my question for those people who were saying that, was, what are they going to spend it on? Are they going to spend it on weeding out people who are not vaccinated? Or are they spend it on CRT training amongst the troops? Are they spend it on transgender surgeries and that kind of stuff? What exactly you're spending this money on? Because unless you're spending money on material and training troops how to kill people and break things, unless you're spending on that, I don't want to spend any more money with the Pentagon. And Secretary Lloyd Austin is not dedicated to basic stuff like training our troops to kill people and break things. That's their job. Their job is not to become social justice warriors. And the fact that they're trying to weed out people who have religious reasons for not getting vaccinated, people who don't believe they should be compelled to be vaccinated, whether they want to or not, they're weeding out anybody who has any semblance of independent thought out of the military is a dangerous outcome of this whole COVID thing. And I want you to understand the Democrats pushed it, but the Republicans allowed it. And we have to fix that. So, and with that, I appreciate everybody who's commented. I appreciate everybody who stayed with us. I have no idea how long I've been on here babbling about stuff. But with that, continue fighting for freedom. Subscribe to the site. If you want to get a notification for when we're having one of these things. It's typically around 4:00 during the day, during the weekdays. But go ahead and click the bell for notification. And I would urge you to tell friends and and have them sign up to subscribe to Americans for Limited Government at getliberty.org. Just subscribe. You get a free email every single day. I'm telling you what's going on. And occasionally you get, about twice a week, you get emails with special alerts of things that need to happen to try to keep our America free. With that, thank you very much and have a great day.